No matter someone's circumstances in life, I always believe there's going to be things that people take for granted, such as health. That's why I chose this quote from Hippocrates. It says, "Healing is a matter of time, but is also sometimes a matter of opportunity." And this is something that I found very apparent through my ISM journey this year, because specifically, I'll talk more about this later, but my mentor, her office is in Dallas, and it's in an area where the kids are not nearly as privileged as they are here. And I grew up in the Frisco-Plano area, so I feel like it's safe to say I've grown up living a very privileged life, even if while I was growing up I didn't think I did. But it's something that I've definitely noticed throughout my ISM journey. Why pediatric physical therapy? I chose pediatric physical therapy because this is something that I wasn't really sure about going into ISM, but I knew that I wanted to do something where I worked with kids, and I knew I wanted to do something in the health field. And my brother, who is actually going to school to become a physical therapist right now in Louisiana, he was actually talking to me a lot about physical therapy the summer before my junior year. And so this was something that kind of popped into my mind, and I kind of debated whether or not I could see myself doing pediatric physical therapy. And as I actually came into this program doing pediatric nursing, and so I talked to Coach Goff within the first 2 weeks of school, and she told me it was okay if I wanted to change my subject. Before I get to interviews, I want to talk a little bit about myself. My name is Lauren Bradford, and I'm a junior here at Frisco High School. And I'm a drum major for the band, and I also play club soccer for Liverpool. And the reason I took ISM, like I said a little bit before, is because I wanted to know what I wanted to do before I went to college. And I know it's not a sure thing going in that I was going to figure out what I wanted to do, but I felt like this is a class that a lot of people don't get to take. They don't get to know what they want to do when they go into college. And this sometimes results in a lot of people changing their major halfway through school and ending up having to do more years of college. And that wasn't really something that I felt like I wanted to do, so I wanted to know before I started applying, actually getting into college, what I wanted to do. So for my interviews, my first interview was with Katie Brown, and she worked at Suggs. It's really long. It's called Spots, but it's, sorry, I'm gonna have to really think about this. It's Spots, so Suggs Pediatric Outpatient Therapy Services. Yes, that's it. Remembered it. And so with my interview with Katie, this was my first interview, so I was obviously pretty nervous, but Katie was very welcoming, and she made me feel really comfortable the second I started this interview with her. And one of the big things that we talked about was the different types of physical therapy. Like, she wanted to make sure that I wasn't limiting myself to just thinking about pediatrics, when there's so many other fields. There's geriatrics, and there's orthopedic, and there's sports PT. And so she really talked about all of that kind of stuff with me. And she also talked about the pay of pediatrics. Pediatrics is actually the lowest paying division of physical therapy, which I hadn't really thought about before. And I asked her, one of my interview questions was, is this something that you think turns people away from pediatrics? And she said she doesn't think it's like that at all. She thinks that everyone who does pediatric physical therapy truly does it because they love working with kids. So the pay that they're making isn't really a concern for them. Which, that was, yeah, I got that right. Okay. Candace Kramer was my second interview, and she works at Integrative Pediatric Therapy, and there's a Dallas and a Plano clinic, so she kind of goes back and forth between the two of them. And one of the big things that I talked about with her was communication, because before, I knew that they had to talk to the parents, obviously, because the kids aren't going to remember how to do the stuff themselves. But it wasn't really something that I thought about, like, communicating wise, all the different ways that you would have to convey what you have to do. Like, I know when you're in the sessions with the child, it's all fun and games, but when these parents are bringing their kids to physical therapy, there's something wrong with their child. So they're obviously going to be very concerned. So she talked to me a lot about, there's a bunch of parents who are going to be really worried, and so you have to convey what you want them to do in a very simplistic manner, make it very easy for them so that they're not freaking out all the time, trying to make sure that their child is going to be the best it can be. And she also talked to me about the process of creating a treatment plan, And so the treatment plan is basically how the physical therapist knows what they're going to do for each session. And specifically at integrated pediatric therapy, what they do is when they receive a new patient, they do an evaluation. So this is just an hour-long observation where they just give the child simple tasks to do, and they basically give them a score of how well they can do it. And this is what I ended up doing my original work on, which I'll talk about more later. And after my interview with Candace, she actually let me do an hour-long observation, which was totally cool. It was like, this was the interview that I really, really remember because of this observation. And this was not something I was expecting. I didn't ask her for this observation. Whenever I emailed her asking if I could interview her, she agreed right away, and she was so excited. She's like, there's a kid that I really want you to meet. I think you'll love him. And so I ended up getting to do this observation, and it was really interesting. I just kind of sat out to the side because I wasn't really comfortable, but I did take notes over what they did. And it was really interesting to see because she would talk to me while they were doing activities, and she would say, okay, now look at what he's doing. And then she would ask me questions like, what do you think he's doing this for? Like, what muscles do you think this is working? And it was really interesting because I had never really thought about applying like how many different muscle groups they were all working. And it was totally crazy to me to think that one simple like swing could be working 3 different parts of your body at the same time. Jessica Coates was my third interview, and she was actually an occupational therapist. And I got her contact information from Candace, who wanted me to get the view of an occupational therapist before I set my mind on physical therapy. And the difference between occupational therapy and physical therapy is mainly it's fine motor for occupational and gross motor for physical therapy. And what this means is fine motor skills is like your handwriting, what you do with your fingers, and gross motor is more like, can you bend your arm like this? Can you kick your leg? It's more of the whole body. And it was interesting talking to Jessica because I know at different places they have different styles of teaching, obviously, but because she works at integrated pediatric therapy, the lines kind of overlap because it's a sensory integration practice, which means that they're not going to just limit you to one activity. If it's going to work fine and gross motor, they're all for it. They want to make sure that you're not just developing one muscle because then that muscle is going to be stronger than your other muscles. They want to make sure that you're developing as a whole person. My next interview was with Melissa Koch. This was a phone interview because she works at Children's Dallas and my parents weren't comfortable with me driving out there, which is fine. And she was really interesting to talk to because she works in the neurological department. And so this was really interesting to hear because honestly, this seems like something that would be really interesting to me, but it would also be very tolling. Like, it would be hard because this is the difference between this and where the other people I had interviewed before had worked is the kids who Melissa sees, they knew how to do something and then they got in an accident and now they can't do it. So it's different from my other interviews where these children had been born with their disability, so they never knew what it was like. So they're still learning how to do it. But these kids, they know what it's like to lose that ability. So just I feel like seeing these kids be so frustrated with themselves because they knew how to do something before and now they can't, it would be so hard. Because it's already hard to see these kids who were born with disabilities, so I would just feel like neurological stuff would make it so much harder. And she also got me interested in possibly minoring in Spanish in college because she works in an area of Dallas where it's predominantly Hispanic. And so there's a lot of times where they have sessions with children and they have to have a translator in there. And I feel like that's one thing that could kind of disrupt what you're trying to do with the child because you're not on as, like, it's not as strong of a personal connection with the child because it's not just you and the child, there's somebody else there. My next interview was with Bonnie Rogers. She works at Integrated Pediatric Therapy in Dallas, and it was really cool talking to her because she asked me how I got interested in pediatric physical therapy, and this was the first interview where anybody had asked me that, so she kind of caught me off guard, which I thought was really cool at the end of my interview. And so once she asked me that question, I kind of went back at her. I said, how did you get interested in this topic? And she was actually interested because she used to play volleyball in high school and she tore her ACL. And so she had to go to physical therapy. And so through her physical therapy process, she decided that it was something that she might want to do. And another big thing that we talked about during our interview was balancing your schoolwork and college. And she said that this was something that she kind of struggled with. And it's just because when she was in high school, she took some easier classes. And so whenever she was pushed into this college environment and you're on your own, it was a lot harder to keep up with everything and make sure everything's getting in on time. It's very up to you. And she also talked to me about physical therapy school. And she went to Texas Tech for her undergrad and for her graduate. And so how it works for physical therapy is you do 4 undergraduate years at whatever school you want to go to. And then there's select physical therapy schools. Not every school has a physical therapy school. In physical therapy school, it's usually 2 to 3 years after your undergraduate, and you have to apply. And as my brother's actually applying for this, I'm learning a lot more about whenever I'm going to have to apply, because he's applying to some colleges where they take 100 out of 700 applicants. And that's just in like the Texas region. And so these are people applying from Texas and all over the state. Specifically, like my brother's applying to UT Southwestern and TWU, and those are like 2 of the biggest physical therapy schools in Texas. And it's ridiculous crazy to get in. If you don't have like a 3.8, it's very difficult to get in. And so she really talked to me about that. For my research, I did my first research assessment over spina bifida. And spina bifida is damage to the nerves around the spinal cord, and this can lead to hydrocephalus, which is fluid in your skull. And so obviously you don't want to have more fluid in your brain than you already have. And this is something that there's no way to prevent it medically, so it's just something, it's kind of like a freak thing. You don't really know if it's going to happen or not. And then my second research assessment was over Asperger's syndrome. Asperger's syndrome is an autism spectrum disorder. It's more, you would consider it a social impairment. These children usually have a lack of communication skills and very patterned behavior. And you can usually detect it before the age of 2, but sometimes you don't see it in children until they're 6 or 7 years old. And something that was really interesting about this is males are 4 times more likely to have Asperger's syndrome than females are. My next research assessment was over play therapy, and this is when we went down to UNT. And this was pretty interesting because it was more of a counseling class, which I wasn't really expecting, but I still got a lot out of it. And the big thing that they talked about was encouragement versus praise. And encouragement means that there is still room for improvement, whereas praise means that you're basically telling them like, hey, you've done the best you can do, like you don't have to do it anymore. And so this is something that I thought was really important, because when you're working with these kids, you need to make sure that you're conveying your like gratitude for what they're doing in a specific way, because if you're telling them, if you're giving them too much praise, they're going to think that they're great and that they don't have to do anything anymore. Whereas if you're encouraging them, you're always like letting them know, hey, there's room to get better. And so for my fourth research assessment, I did cerebral palsy. And this was actually, I thought about doing this one after my interview with Candace, because the child that I observed had cerebral palsy. And it permanently affects muscle movement and body coordination, but it doesn't get worse. So this is something that it can be improved, but it's not going to get like any worse. So this is, it's sad, but at the same time, it's one of the better things that could happen, because it can always get better. And the cool thing, well, it's not cool, but I thought it was kind of interesting, is that it ranges from inabilities to walk to you might not ever even detect it. And I thought that was kind of like a really broad spectrum, which is why I thought it was really interesting. My fifth research assessment was over occupational versus physical therapy, and I thought about doing this one after my interview with Jessica Coates, because she was an occupational therapist. And the big difference, like I talked about earlier, was fine motor versus gross motor skills. And for physical therapy, you have to have a doctorate, and for occupational therapy, you only have to have a master's. And another difference is that physical therapists have to be licensed, and occupational therapists, your licensing depends on which state you practice in. And also, physical therapists get paid a lot more than occupational therapists do. By a lot, I mean like $5,000 more a year. I feel like that's a lot. But, and And the thing is about the two of them is they have different like specialties that you can go into. For physical therapy, it's mainly pediatrics, orthopedics, geriatrics, stuff like that. And for occupational therapy, it's more speech, and you can work in the school systems and different, like, you're really getting personal with the children. For my 6th research assessment, I did it over scoliosis. And scoliosis is a curvature of the spine. You guys have all been tested for it in high school. It's really awkward when you get the blue slip and you have to go down to the nurse's office. It's really fun. But it can be classified as 2 different types. It's non-structural, which is where you can still function, and structural scoliosis can be caused by neuromuscular diseases such as cerebral palsy, and it can also be caused by muscular dystrophy or birth defects. And structural scoliosis is when the fixed curve of the spine can be treated by doctors. So for my mentor, I chose Bonnie Rogers just because I could really communicate very well with her in our interview, and it was more like I was talking to a friend than I was talking to a professional, which she is. She's still very professional. But the hard thing about having Bonnie as a mentor sometimes is our schedules, because she works part-time, so she works Monday, Tuesday, Thursday from 10 until 5, which it was really rough first semester because I had it first period, so we got out at 10:30. So setting up visits then was kind of rough, but we figured it out now where there'll be one week where I don't go, and then the next week I'll go on Tuesday and Thursday. So we ended up figuring out a pretty good system. And like I talked about earlier, she went to Texas Tech for her undergraduate and for her graduate. And before she went into pediatrics, she actually did a lot of hospital work. And she was really interesting to talk to you about this because she said that she enjoyed it, but when she decided to start having a family, the hours were too rough. So going into a smaller practice and working part-time ended up being a lot better for her. And one cool thing about working with Bonnie is whenever she's playing in the gym with the kids, you can truly see that she enjoys what she's doing. And it's really cool also, you can tell that the other therapists in the gym look up to her, because whenever somebody has a question, Bonnie's the first person that they go to, which made me feel even better about my choice as picking her for my mentor, because I just felt like I was going to learn the most I possibly could. For my mentorship, what we do is on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'll come down and I'll do an hour-long observation on each days. And it's really cool because I'm learning how to plan activities for different kids. Like Bonnie has started to ask me questions like, okay, if I want to work these muscle groups, what activity would you want the child to do? And I'll have about 15 minutes and then I'll put it together and the kid will actually get to do it. It's really cool. And working with the kids, I've actually gotten to work with about 3 or 4 different kids, and these are the same 3 or 4 kids I see every Tuesday, Thursday. And it's really interesting because I can truly see the growth that each child is making, which is truly inspirational, because some of these kids when I first met them, they did not want to listen to Bonnie at all. Like, if Bonnie said anything that they didn't want to do, they would literally run out of the gym. And so Bonnie had to have a few talks with them, but after that, like, you can truly see these kids, they start behaving, they really want to get better. And that's one thing that's really inspirational for me. For my original work, I talked a little bit about this earlier. What I wanted to do was do a sample evaluation, and you guys actually got to help me with that, which was actually really fun. I told Bonnie about that and she thought it was hilarious. So for the sample evaluation, I had 2 different options, which was the BOT2 and the PDMS2. And the difference between these was the BOT2 is what they normally use at integrated pediatric therapy. And what it is, it's it's more simplistic in the way that it's laid out. It's that bottom picture on the left. And what it is it comes with this little booklet. I would show it to you, but it's in my portfolio. So what it is it's laid out and it has a bunch of activities that are in a booklet. And so you give the booklet to the child and they do all of the activities, and then once they've done all the activities, you go back and you score it. And there's a very strict rubric to go off of. Like if they have to draw a circle, the rubric will show you different types of circles. Like if the lines overlap, like going like this across, instead of going like this across, it's like 3 points versus 2 points. And so basically you add all of the points up for each activity, and then you enter those into a computer system, and it prints out, it's really neat, it prints out like a 6-page like thing that you can actually give to the parents that describes each activity and what they're missing to get that perfect score. And the PDMS-2, I was like immediately kind of like, it was too much reading. And Bonnie even says, she's like, I don't like this one, too much reading, not okay. And so this one, really, the range was only from 0 to 2. The child could either get 0, 1, or 2 points. And I felt like that was kind of not as like in depth. I feel like you were kind of more making generalizations than you were with the Bot 2. And so after you guys helped me with this and I added up all my information and ran it through the computer system, I had to create a treatment plan, which is what is on the right. And so Bonnie talked to me about making a treatment plan. And what you have to do is you have to list out all of the strengths and the weaknesses that the child has. And the important thing with the weaknesses is that, so it doesn't look so negative whenever you're presenting it to the parents, there always has to be a goal and activity that can go with the weakness. So like if somebody has less, like they can't catch a ball very well, and you write that as a weakness, you have to have a goal of, okay, by the end of next week, they need to be able to catch the ball 5 times in a row without dropping it. And so for the activity, you would maybe create a game, like relate it to a movie that they just saw or something, and they can be the character, and you could be like throwing them their weapon or whatever they need. And so as long as you have a goal and an activity for each weakness, like you're set. It's a lot easier. And so that's actually what I have the stars by, are the weaknesses, and then I have the arrows drawn out to the goal and then an arrow down to the activity. And this was really interesting because I thought it would be a lot harder than it really ended up being, but because I had done so many observations, seeing what Bonnie had done and what the other physical and occupational therapists had done with their patients, it made it really easy to kind of mix together and like take apart different activities that I had seen them doing with their patients. And this was actually really fun because I felt like I was really learning something, because I was just able to write something down and be like, oh yeah, I remember them doing this. Like this would work these muscle groups. This would be perfect for this. And so where it says the evaluation process, where it was fine versus gross motor, this is more back to the Bot 2. And that was where they had a little booklet where they did the handwriting, and then the gross motor stuff was the stuff that I did with you guys, where I made Alex stand on his foot for 30 seconds, and then he had to do it for 30 seconds with his eyes closed. And you can definitely feel the difference, like your ankles get a little bit shaky. And this is what I was talking about with alterations, because obviously Alex is going to have more ability than a 4-year-old little child with a disorder. We would hope so, at least. But so it was definitely interesting because I talked to Bonnie about this, and so what I ended up doing is whenever I saw Alex's ankle like shift, I would count 1. And so however many times his ankle shifted, that's the number that I would take off. Whereas if the child was doing it, the likelihood of them standing on their foot and not doing anything is like very slim. So the child, what they usually do, I'm probably gonna break my ankle, but they like stand on one foot, and every time that they put their foot down, you take off a point. And so it's really hard for them, and it's kind of hard to see them do that because it's something that we consider so easy, and it's really hard for these children. So it's kind of interesting seeing them do it and then coming here and seeing you guys do it. And you guys were like all over it too. It's really cool. So my original final product plan is kind of different than what I actually ended up doing. But what I originally wanted to do was create some type of gym equipment. And Bonnie and I had talked about this from the second I selected her as my mentor. She's all for it. She's like, I want you to create a piece of gym equipment that we could use here. And so we talked about making different stuff. And originally we wanted to make a swing. And all of the swings in the gym are made out of a foam block material. And these are some of the swings that they actually have in the gym. And we also wanted to make sure that it wasn't just for physical therapy. We wanted to make sure that it could also be used by the occupational therapist for fine motor related games. And so it was really rough because sometimes like it's really hard to think about the fine motor stuff whenever you're trying to sculpt it for a physical therapy activity. So what we ended up doing is we took this swing right here, and this is actually taken in the gym, and this swing, they call it the horse swing. And Bonnie and I, we really talked about what the gym didn't have. And so one big thing that she knew she had wanted for a long time is something that enclosed the child while they were swinging in the air. Because it's one thing to be swinging in the air and the child not to have control over their body, but when they're enclosed, it works on their spatial awareness. Like, it's the same thing for whenever you're walking in a straight line, and then when you walk in a straight line with your eyes closed, it's a lot harder. And so these kids, what she wanted them to be able to do is like crawl across the swing while it's swaying back and forth and being closed. So they're really having to focus on putting their right hand on their left knee, like really focusing on getting through the swing without tumbling over or something like that. And so what we originally wanted to do was build the whole swing with the enclosure. So we originally talked about making it cylindrical, but we realized that this was going to be a lot of money, and I don't have money, so what we talked about doing was just creating a cover for it. And originally we talked about making it semicircular, but we realized since we're going to use this swing, it'd be easier to do something that was a little bit more structured. So what we're ending up doing is creating it like part of a square. So it's just going to make the whole swing a square with the cover on it. And what we're actually going to do with this is we're going to use PVC pipe and then the foam material in between the PVC. So it's kind of going to be structured like a box. And then what we're actually wrapping it with is the same material that they use for the swings, and we found out it's called marine vinyl. Really random. But so it'll actually match the swings. And it's really cool because now that we're making a cover, it's actually going to be more useful in the gym because they can take it off, and they can also use it on the ground for kids to just crawl through in like an obstacle course. And so we talked to Bonnie about changing the idea, and she was actually all for it because she knew currently they use like a refrigerator box as something that the kids can crawl through. And it's all right for them, but I feel like if they actually had something that they could use that was actually more structured, it would look a lot nicer, and it would be a lot nicer for the kids to go through. And the cool thing about the cover also is that we talked about making inserts that could go in it that could make it more difficult, and which is actually something that we were talking about is the mat that you see in the back of that picture. It's basically just like a giant pillowcase filled with foam blocks. And so we talked about making something kind of like that you could just like clip on the outsides of the enclosure, and it would make it a lot tighter on the child so that instead of just going through and nothing touching them, when things touch them, it makes them kind of like freak out because it's like things are touching you, like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through here? So they really have to like push through and actually like work on all of their muscles, like pushing through it, making sure that they can still swing back and forth and be enclosed. Kind of sounds like torture when I say it like that, but these kids, if you relate it to any type of movie or game or something, they're all for it. They're going to do it like in a heartbeat. And so my closing remarks, what I learned in ISM is I learned a lot about being professional and public speaking. And these were both things that I thought I knew, but I really didn't until I got into ISM. I remember for my first speech, I was freaking out, and it only had to be 10 minutes long. And here I am today, and it's really not that big of a deal for me. And for professionalism, it was really interesting because for my interviews, I knew that you had to look nice, but once Coach Goff was talking to us about it, she's like, dresses need to be below the knee, and I was like, I don't have anything like that. And so really going out and like buying stuff for ISM made me feel more professional. For my future plans, next year in ISM, I've decided that I also want to look at different types of physical therapy because now that I know that I do enjoy pediatrics, I want to know if there's something that I might enjoy more. And so earlier in the year, whenever I sprained my ankle, I had to go to sports physical therapy. And this is definitely something that I also found interesting. And so next year I plan on doing sports physical therapy as my topic, just so I can kind of see the difference in between pediatrics and sports, so that I can hopefully have a better idea of when I go into college. And it's really interesting with that because in physical therapy school, you don't just go in and say, I want to do pediatrics. Like, they make you go through each and everything. Like there's a week where you're going to do